One thing that Obama ended his speech with is his solid, total commitment to Israel's security, but that's common. But he added more. He said to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. No other US president has made it part of his policy to defend Israel as a Jewish state as much as Obama. Bush mentioned it a couple of times, so did Clinton, but Obama made it a policy, an official policy of the US, to defend Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Before I talk about the Jewish part of the Jewish and democratic state, let's discuss the democracy aspect, because this is the biggest myth about Israel being the only democracy, the villa in the midst of the Arab jungle, and so on and so forth. Israeli historian Ilan Pape had this to say about this democracy aspect of Israel. He said, quote, "Israel is what we in political science call a Herrenvolk democracy, democracy only for the masters. The fact that you allow people to participate in the formal side of democracy, namely to vote or to be elected, is meaningless if you don't give them any share in the common good or in the common resources of the state, or if you discriminate against them despite the fact that you allow them to participate in the elections. On almost every level," Ilan Pape says, "from official legislation through governmental practices to social and cultural attitudes, Israel is only a democracy for one ethnic group," end of quote. So Israel might be a democracy for its Jewish citizens, but it's certainly an apartheid for its non-Jewish citizens. But why this apartheid label? I mean, I'm invited here by the Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid and Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, Students Against Israeli Apartheid. Why are Palestine solidarity groups insisting on this apartheid epithet? I mean, aren't they inflammatory? Aren't they exaggerating? Okay, Israel is nasty, but I mean, why apartheid? It allows Arabs to vote, despite what Ilan Pape is saying.
If Israel's so nasty, why don't the Muslims lead us?
So, talking about Israel being nasty, many of its supporters are nastier. Anyway, let's go back to the apartheid issue, because we don't throw terms around without having a very clear definition that abides by international law definitions. Because in our movement, in the BDS movement, we have two pillars, international law and human rights, and nothing else. Those are our references. So when we say Israel is an apartheid, we're referring to a system of institutional, legal discrimination. Not just racism. You have racism in Canada, you have racism in many, many countries. Well, Canada is a great area, whether it's applying apartheid policies or not against the indigenous. But regardless, when you have institutional and legal discrimination, then it certainly fits the UN definition of apartheid. The UN says apartheid is not a patent in South Africa, it's a universal crime. It's a universal crime, defined as a systematic system of discrimination of one racial group against another that is coded in law, that is legalized, that is institutionalized. That's what makes Israel an apartheid state. It has tens of laws, literally. Inside Israel, forget the occupied territories where it's obviously an apartheid, but inside Israel itself, against its own non-Jewish citizens, it applies laws that discriminate against non-Jewish citizens. The most blatant example is nationality. Israel is the only country on earth that does not recognize its own nationality. There's no such thing as Israeli nationality. It recognizes some 130 nationalities, but not Israeli. So Jewish Israelis who tried to go to court, to the Supreme Court, to have the Interior Ministry recognize them as Israelis, not Jews, failed. The Supreme Court said no. So did the Knesset, so did the government. Because recognizing an Israeli nationality would equate Palestinians and Israeli Jews within Israel. And that would be a disaster for the Zionist hegemonic exclusionary system. So Israel does not recognize an Israeli nationality. It says Jewish nationals, which is a very problematic, legally problematic term, because it's an extraterritorial definition of nationality that defies international law. In international law, you cannot say the nationals of the state are all over the world. So Israel is not a state of its citizens, it's a state of the Jewish, so-called Jewish people around the world, which makes it a very racist state. Citizens of the state of Israel, like my wife, who happen to be non-Jewish, cannot become nationals of the state. It's not their state. It's not defined as their state. They get certain rights, but not others. So they cannot own land, for example, on 93% of the area of Israel. It's only preserved for Jews, not for non-Jews. And there are many, many other laws that I can go into about the discrimination. But recently, with the rise of racist laws being passed by the Knesset, one law, for example, says that Jewish communities in Israel can exclude others on the basis of culture. You know, Israel tries to be a sophisticated apartheid because white-black is old-fashioned. So they do it in a much more sophisticated way. So they say on cultural grounds you can exclude others. So if you don't fit in culturally, you just can be excluded. And of course, Arabs naturally cannot fit in. I mean, they're excluded. So that's now allowed by Knesset law. And there's so many other racist laws that have been passed recently, to the extent loyalty law, which says that non-Jews applying for citizenship in Israel have to swear allegiance to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Jews do not have to, because many ultra-Orthodox Jews will never pledge allegiance to Israel as a Jewish democratic state because they do not recognize Israel as a Jewish state on religious grounds. But they don't force them. They can become citizens, nationals in a flash. But those others applying will have to pledge allegiance to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. This led many leading academics and cultural figures in Israel to start using the term fascist to describe Israel. And this is a direct quote. So for those of you who will misquote me tomorrow and say Omar called Israel fascist, I'm quoting Israeli academics and cultural figures. It's not my quote, and I think it's a bit exaggerated, to be honest. But regardless, it's very interesting. I mean, Israel has fascist policies, but to call it a fascist state is a bit of an exaggeration. And as I said before, the Zionist liberals, when they get mad, they tend to exaggerate. So one award-winning academic, Gabriel Solomon, went as far as comparing today's Israel to Germany in the 1930s. He said, quote, "The idea of Judenrein, Jew-free zone, or Arab Rein is not new. Some might say, how can you compare us to Nazis?" So he says, "I'm not talking about the death camps, but about the year 1935. There were no camps yet, but there were racist laws. And we are heading toward these kinds of laws. The government of Israel is clearly declaring our incapacity for democracy." Someone from the very top of the Israeli establishment, Avraham Burg, who was the head of the Israeli Knesset for many, many years, head of the Jewish Agency, so really from the core establishment, Zionist establishment, had even worse descriptions of Israel, believe it or not. He said, "The establishment of the State of Israel," and this was recently published in March, I think this year, "the establishment of the State of Israel not only failed to solve the problems for the sake of which it was founded, but on the contrary, made them a great deal worse. Israel is the biggest shtetl." I don't know what the exact English translation. Shtetl is from the East European ghettos. Ghetto, possibly. I lived in New York, so shtetl is normal language word. Like chutzpah, like so. We grew with that. Anyway, Israel is the biggest shtetl in the history of the world. One big town around which walls of segregation and resentment rise higher every day, cutting it off from its surroundings. Few of us know any other existential reality apart from our unrelenting war with everyone all the time and over all issues. And that's Avraham Burg.